All right, we will now begin our second session, Advancing Cross-Theater Cooperation in the Age of Strategic Flux. The moderator is Professor Takako Hikotani of the Center for Global Education at the University of Tokyo. Professor Hikotani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Welcome to our session, Advancing Cross-Theater Cooperation in the Age of Strategic Flux. Our discussion today focuses on a central challenge of the current security environment. How can countries strengthen cooperation across regions at a time when geopolitical competition is intensifying and developments in the one theater increasingly affect others? We're seeing growing connections between security challenges in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated that regional conflicts can have broader global implications. China's support for Russia through economic channels, dual-use exports, and diplomatic backing has become an important factor in Europe's security environment, while deepening military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is reshaping the strategic calculations in East Asia. At the same time, allies and partners are facing difficult questions about how to manage competing demands and strengthen collective resilience. Uncertainty surrounding the future direction of US strategic engagement, combined with the challenge of sustaining commitments across multiple theaters, have heightened the importance of the greater coordination among partners and stronger contributions from countries themselves. For middle powers in particular, the question is how they can work together to reinforce deterrence, enhance their own capabilities, and contribute to a stable and resilient international order. Today's discussion will explore how governments are interpreting these shifts and how they are balancing alliance commitments with greater responsibility, and how cross-theater cooperation can help address an increasingly complex security environment. But we would like to start from a more broader theme, and I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Chang. Perhaps drawing on your distinguished diplomatic career and long experience observing international affairs, how do you assess the broader transformation taking place in today's international order, especially from the viewpoint of the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank JIIA for the invitation to be present at this forum. It's always a pleasure to be in Japan. I'm not one of those many tourists that come every year to eat sushi, but I really do appreciate, the aesthetics of Japan and really what hospitality you have provided, and the think tanks and universities for their contribution to the discourse of the Indo-Pacific. Let me say that clearly we are in a strategic flux. You have asked me, how do I see the larger picture of the Indo-Pacific? It is very clear to us that the United States, the architect of the post-World War II order, is less willing to play the role of guarantor of global security. It is much more selective in where it wants to intervene. This, in fact, is posing an enormous challenge to those of us who have worked closely with the United States. And in the Asia-Pacific, the United States has been the guarantor of peace and security in the region for the last 70 years, 80 years, more 70 years, I would say. China is now a risen power, but what sort of power will China be? I think that is what many countries are thinking. To be fair, the Chinese are also thinking this through. I was in Tsinghua University earlier this year, and Chinese academics and ex-policymakers, former policymakers, were asking themselves and the audience, how should China behave? They do not want to be a US hegemon, but how would they behave as a great power, a superpower? And there is India, another rising power, not the same level as China, but what role will India play? That is a question we ask too. And Russia seems interested to play in the Asia-Pacific, and there's North Korea and the threats, of their expansion of their nuclear power. But on the whole, I would say the region is relatively stable. However, we should not let the long peace lull us into thinking it is going to be a cakewalk. we have to look towards the future dangers on the horizon. In the Indo-Pacific countries, in the Indo-Pacific region, countries are trying to build internally their resilience, and externally, they are building new partnerships. So middle powers and other middle powers work together. Small states are working with middle powers to strengthen themselves. It was earlier discussed in the last session, Mark Carney's point about middle powers coming together in view of the retrenchment of the US foreign policy position, and because there's a new US power behaving in a way that we're not familiar with. But I would say middle powers coalition is more likely to be amongst the middle powers who are allies of the United States. They have a habit of working together. I cannot see how Brazil and India and UAE will work, with some of the others. So, but small states are trying to work with middle powers. This is especially so in the ASEAN countries. But I would say countries in the region still see the United States playing a significant role in the security of our region, and they would like to offer support to make this more enduring. Now, your title of this discussion is on advancing cross-theater cooperation in an age of strategic flux. And I expect you would want us to discuss the role of Europe, because the United States is already in the region and has a history, decades of history of working with countries in the region. I want to make 3 points about this cross-border cooperation or collaboration. And I speak from the ASEAN point of view. First of all, let me say, our region, ASEAN, is not enthusiastic about the concept of cross-theater cooperation. It is not just a geographic concept, but it conveys a military dimension as well. We do not think NATO should be in our region. NATO is designed to tackle European issues. European naval ships do sail in the South China Sea. That is fine. It is, after all, international sea lanes. The South China Sea is international sea lanes. And if the British ship, the French ship, the German ship wishes to sail through the sea lanes, it's good. It reaffirms the status of the freedom of navigation in international sea lanes. But I think we have said, fly your national flag, don't fly the NATO flag, because then you invite the countervailing coalitions to happen. Besides, we think NATO doesn't quite understand Asian security issues. I know there's a lot of talk about cross-theater, but we remember that when the Ukraine war first started, European analysts said, Russia invaded Ukraine, China will invade Taiwan. And we thought how wrong that is, because Taiwan is the corest of core issues for China. China will not let Russia set the agenda for Taiwan. China will deal with Taiwan on its own timetable. So I feel there's a lack of full understanding of the Asian security issues. So that is the first point. The second point, ASEAN's approach to security problems is inclusive, not exclusive. That is why we have the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. NATO thinks in exclusive terms in security, containment, you leave things out. We have differences in ASEAN. We have differences with China. We have differences amongst ourselves. We have disputes, but we try to work together at the same time. My former Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, said at a Nikkei seminar here, a conference here a couple of years ago before he stepped down, that we understand that countries with the same congruent interests in security would come together to deal with a potential adversary. But at the same time, he said, we should also build confidence-building measures with the adversary, potential adversary. That way, you generate greater stability. I think that is a very ASEAN approach. And finally, the third point I want to make is that for ASEAN to deal with cross-theater cooperation, military cooperation, ASEAN on a regional basis will be slow. And it will be, in fact, not easy because we do not have a shared threat perception. That we have totally different strategic perspectives in different countries. Some countries have the same threat perception, others do not. And so we generally move at a very low level in terms of full regional grouping for military cooperation or anything hinting of military. We have the ADMM plus, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, plus when we meet with partners outside the region. But on the whole, we work together on humanitarian disaster relief. So in terms of working, how we would collaborate and work with out-of-region partners, I would say in ASEAN's view is that it is up to each country. It's their sovereign right to work with an out-of-region partner. The Philippines at the moment works with Japan, Australia, Canada, Britain. They've signed a status of forces agreement with these out-of-region partners. And Indonesia has signed a defense agreement with United States. Singapore and Malaysia have long ago signed a five-power defense pact with Britain. Australia partners us and New Zealand. And that was when we became independent. We have individual arrangements. But for NATO to come, for us to think of NATO coming into the region and working with us, I think would take a long time for it to sink in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for, it's really good to start with a somewhat provocative statement. Since the topic is cross-theater cooperation, we tend to assume that that's a good thing. But to have a starting point saying that that's not necessarily the case, I think is very important. So let me turn to you, Mr. Bassi, about your outlook of the security situation. I think maybe you might disagree with Ambassador Chan about whether the Indo-Pacific is relatively stable, and also how much there might be a convergence in interest between NATO and how you see the prospect of the Asian region, and from the view of Australia and from the view of an overall expert on this topic.
Great. Well, thank you. I too want to start by thanking JIIA for convening the conference, for the invitation. It is fabulous to be back here with you. I think the makeup of the panel is superb, having Australian, Japanese, an ASEAN perspective and a European perspective will hopefully ensure there are differences. You're right, and with due respect, and I think we've enjoyed a pre-conversation as well. From the Australian perspective, and I don't speak for the Australian government, but from an Australian perspective, I think that we need to be able to do multiple things at once. We have to respect the ASEAN view and the ASEAN way. But I'm of the view that ASEAN is fortunate to have Australia and Japan as regional powers who are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to constraining China in this region. And without Australia and Japan in particular, the region would not have a power that would allow other nations to have sovereignty. the difference between what we would have with a China power as opposed to the US power is that for all the mistakes the US has made since World War II, the US has allies and friends and encourages every nation to be itself. China wants every nation to simply follow China's rules, none of which would suit our way of life. From an Australian government perspective, that you could see as set out in its very recent National Defence Strategy. The other area, I think, of nuance, there are similarities, but the nuance is that Australia does not believe it is a stable region anymore. The recent defence strategy that was issued by the Deputy Prime Minister said that we should no longer say that we are living in a time of deteriorating circumstances. The times have already deteriorated. We're no longer, as governments, as industry, as civil society think tanks, we are no longer trying to maintain stability. We're trying to regain it. It is where we absolutely agree, and I think this is why Australia and Japan can work so well with ASEAN, even though there are those differences, is that we agree that we can't be complacent. Whether we are of the view that we have a relatively stable region or we've got instability, it's that absolute objective of not being complacent that I think can bind us. It's true that we don't in this region have the wars of Europe or the Middle East, but we have to recognise that neither of those wars just started when the first bullet was fired. That they began after years of hybrid warfare that, in my view, the democratic nations tried to tolerate, hoping that if we tolerated the activities below the threshold of war, we would never get to war. That has been proven wrong time and time again. And if you have a look at what we have in this region, we've got China aggression on a daily basis against Taiwan, on a daily basis against the Philippines in the South China Sea, against an international ruling that we just had its 10-year anniversary of a very important ruling. The importance of which is that without that ruling, it would just be my opinion up here that the 9-dash line is not international law. It is only because the Philippines saw through that ruling, which to me has to be used as why international rules, international institutions are important. Australia itself was circumnavigated by the PLA Navy in the middle of our election campaign. And of course, just last week or so, there was a test that Andrew Shearer mentioned in the first panel of a ballistic missile submarine launched into the Pacific. And we have daily cyber attacks. That is, unfortunately, an environment of insecurity. And I think the other area that perhaps there's a nuance between Australia and ASEAN is the view that we don't. I think the line that you used, Ambassador, in terms of ASEAN not being enthusiastic about cross-theatre cooperation, not being enthusiastic about the potential for NATO to encroach on this region. If the world were separated into geographies, I would agree that ideally we would not have any of that. The issue is that tell that to China and Russia. China is the main enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine. Russia wouldn't be able to sustain the war on Ukraine without China. I think it's a blight on everybody that we don't say it enough. And the only reason to all of our, I think, should be embarrassment for our nations is that because of how much economic reliance we have on China. If it was anyone else, we would say something differently. North Korea has sent troops to Russia to fight Ukraine. Russia has interests throughout Southeast Asia, throughout South Asia. We have seen them use their media, their national power over their media to try to disrupt election campaigns, including in Solomon Islands. So they are aggressively cooperating across the globe, which means we have to do that as well. I think from an Australian perspective, we have a difference with Prime Minister Carney on how to go about doing it. The idea of a middle power coalition, I think, may work better in Europe than it does in this region. I think the reality for us in this region is that if the US were to leave its Asian allies, we would not be powerful enough to counter China. Australia, Japan, Korea, we wouldn't be able to do it. Whereas I do believe, even though I don't want the US to leave Europe, I desperately don't, Europe is stronger than Russia, can contain Russia if it wanted to without the Americans. It's a lot easier with the Americans, but our region wouldn't be able to do it. So I think what that means is that countries in this region need to work together more. We do need, though, to where Prime Minister Carney is not, I don't completely disagree with him, is that I just think we have to do all things at once. China and Russia show that they can, Russia is showing it can carry out a war in Ukraine while carrying out hybrid warfare across the world. They show that they can do multiple things. We do as well. It's why I do think that the opportunity is not to necessarily have an Asian NATO and not to join NATO, but I think middle grounds, like the idea of a liaison office, for example, in Tokyo, I think should have been accepted by NATO. I think it was a mistake for NATO to reject the liaison office in Tokyo. I do think we need to work together more and more. And I'll finish with a positive. With the 10-year anniversary, with a slight negative in it, but the 10-year anniversary of this Hague ruling on the South China Sea, there were multiple statements put out. There was a statement by that Australia joined with the US, Japan, New Zealand, the UK, the Baltic nations joined it. I think Germany and Italy joined it. It was very interesting as a Pacific power that the French did not join it. I think that's disappointing. I think it was disappointing that Korea in this region didn't join it. It enables China and Russia in Europe, it enables China to split us apart. I think ASEAN should have put out a statement. It didn't have to be provocative. I think we need to be better at working together where there are positives, and we don't have to always poke China in the eye. But on things like that, we need to come together and say this is an international ruling, and if we believe in international law and we're getting angry with the Americans for not adhering to international institutions, how can we actually say to the Americans, do that, if we don't do it ourselves?
Thank you. So next I'd like to turn to Professor Mori. I am guessing that you wouldn't agree that Indo-Pacific is relatively stable, and I think you would lean towards thinking that it's not about maintaining stability, but regaining stability. So how would you see what do you think is the most pressing security challenges in Indo-Pacific might be? And if Japan is trying to regain, I don't know what exactly the right word is, what kind of strategic adjustments has been made by Japan in the region to deal with the challenges that you identify?
Okay, first of all, I want to join other panelists in thanking Jaya for inviting me to this panel. It's a real privilege to be able to speak alongside distinguished panelists. So first of all, the question of what is Japan's most pressing security challenge? The direct answer to that question is China's unilateral revisionist actions, a multifaceted coercion campaign directed against its neighbors. This has been going on for some time. For Japan, China became a major security challenger nearly maybe 15, 16 years ago. But I sense that we are entering a new phase. What do I mean by that? I think particularly in the diplomatic arena, from China's perspective, major power relations is moving in a very favorable direction. And I think the panelists from the former session mentioned about the opportunity to achieve China's dreams and ambitions, right? I think if you look at the diplomatic movements over the past maybe 6, 8 months, you see certain European leaders go to Beijing. Not significant substantial deals, but the appearance of having major European leaders go to Beijing was a diplomatic victory for President Xi, probably. You have President Trump go to Beijing to make very narrow economic deals, but try to establish this new sort of constructive relationship based on strategic stability. And both sides are kind of signaling to stabilize the US-China relations. And then you have Putin go to Beijing as well. So from China's perspective, I think they see the strategic landscape in a very sort of favorable way. And there's this old Chinese strategic adage. In Japanese, we call it enko kinko. It means making friends with nations on the far side to take offensive against nations on the near side. I think as a result of this new sort of situation, China feels very confident that it can pressure its neighbors without substantially compromising its economic relationship with Europe, America. And it can keep Russia being more dependent on China as ever. Mm-hmm. And China is very good at advancing their sort of tactic. They used to call it reactive assertiveness when South China Sea was a more center of focus of attention in the Western Pacific. But what they do is they use other countries' actions as a pretext to take new initiatives that will revise and change and create a new normal. For example, the most recent example is using Japan-Filipino maritime demarcation negotiations as a reason to start law enforcement on the eastern side of Taiwan, for example. So right now, I think China sees a new window of opportunity to advance, to expand its influence in the region. And particularly with regards to Taiwan, they are very committed to deploying their own historical narrative and trying to paint US-China as the protector of status quo and trying to paint the Taiwanese leader as the revisionist leader who is seeking independence, which is not true. But nevertheless, that is the kind of narrative that China is deploying. So both on the ground, you see a sort of a major power diplomatic relations sort of seemingly stabilize. But at the same time, at the local level, we are likely to see a more active gray zone sort of actions. You know, there's this jargon about stability and instability paradox in the nuclear strategy realm. I think what we have is a different type of stability and instability where you have a diplomatic major power stability situation that is sort of instigating instability at the gray zone level. And I think this is what we may see over the next 3 years or so as a result of this new kind of diplomatic engagement. And so Japan, the second question that you asked, what is Japan doing to address or redress this situation? To be very general and to be short, two things. Number one, Japan is trying to become the center or the hub of regional deterrence. I think Japan has been advancing literally with almost all regional states' security cooperation, except Taiwan. And in addition to US-Japan alliance, which is the major backbone, there can be no deterrence whatsoever without the US-Japan alliance. But in addition to that, Japan has been advancing regional, local security networking. And this is becoming very, very important, including with Southeast Asian nations. And also, we are trying to advance economic security initiatives in the region. And this is about reducing dependence on China in critical areas, particularly critical minerals and other advanced technologies and so forth. So both on the defense side and also on the economic and advanced technology side, Japan has been trying to sort of keep up with China's very assertive actions that are trying to sort of expand their dominance in their own way. And so whenever China says they see a great opportunity to achieve their dreams, that generally means sort of a worrying story for us. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to go back to the issue of how different regions view China. But before that, we would like to go over cross-theater to Europe and ask Dr. Simón about the security challenges in Europe. The NATO summit meeting took place last week, And also, I think there was a lot of discussion about Undersecretary of War Elbridge Colby mentioning about the NATO 3.0 and how that might mean for the European countries. But I'm curious to know what you think about that impact in the larger context, including the Pacific. But you've written a lot about the cross-theater cooperation, and I'm curious to know what you think, one, the security challenges in Europe, and two, if we can kind of start the next discussion about security cooperation across theaters. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks indeed to JIIA for the invite. It's great to be here. Let me just offer just a few general thoughts on the theme, and then zoom in on Europe and European challenges specifically, because I think Europeans have been paying close attention to this intense debate that we've seen emanate in Washington, initially on the coattails of the Ukraine war, and now sort of replayed with what's going on in the Middle East. And the debate on whether US engagement in secondary theaters, whether that is Ukraine or Iran, strengthens or weakens America's relative position vis-a-vis China, specifically in the primary theater, i.e. the Indo-Pacific. And I think that requires us to think about the balance between the payoffs and the trade-offs associated with engaging in a secondary theater. Because on the one hand, and I think Justin touched on that more specifically, competition with China is indeed global, right? It's a global phenomenon. And engaging in secondary theaters can generate strategic payoffs in the context of competition with China. So for instance, those making the case back in the days, like 3 or 4 years ago, for engaging in Ukraine, including in the Biden administration, but also in Japan, they argued that by standing up for global norms, whenever and wherever they might be challenged, the US and its allies and partners would send a powerful, even deterring signal, that word was used, to China. And they also said that degrading Russian military power would also set the foundations for the US to rebalance towards the Indo-Pacific in the medium term without having to worry constantly about looking behind its back. On the other hand, it's true that competition with China is global, but it's also true that not everything matters to the same extent in the context of US-China competition, and that the Indo-Pacific is the center of gravity of competition with China, right? At least as it is narrated in the United States. And it's also true, and going back to, you mentioned Colby, it's also true that engaging in secondary theaters creates opportunity costs as it consumes scarce resources. And we've seen that now with Epic Fury, right? With the rapid burnout rate of critical munitions, both offensive and defensive, all of which would be critical in a China context. So I think from a European perspective, to go to your question, this debate has immediate relevance because it intersects directly with questions about the future of US military posture and defense strategy in Europe. And I think regardless of the landing zone, because the United States is now conducting a posture review specifically for Europe, apparently, and we'll see the results at the end of the year, and it's still not clear where the needle is going to point. But what is clear, what seems clear to most, is that there's going to be a downsize in terms of U.S. posture in Europe. And I think what seems clear is that Europe, we're moving towards this scenario in which Europe assumes primary responsibility for conventional deterrence and defense. That's the NATO 3.0 construct. That's basically what it is about. That was the roadmap laid out at the NATO summit in The Hague last year. And again, it was sort of confirmed last week in Ankara. So the issue is no longer military spending, but rather if Europeans can actually translate additional spending, which is coming in, into credible combat power, and effective combat power. I think that has an industrial dimension, to be sure, but I would highlight two issues that I think are critical as we move towards that end goal of Europe assuming primary responsibility for conventional deterrence. The first one has to do with force structure. European militaries, it's true that combined they are bigger than Russia, but they are actually very fragmented. And I think this is a very important point that is often overlooked, right? I mean, if you compare Europe to Russia in sort of gross absolute terms, sure. But European militaries remain very fragmented, too nationally compartmentalized, and insufficiently integrated into larger multinational warfighting formations. So the challenge is not simply increasing defense spending or taking defense seriously, or even generating additional brigades, but creating integrated land, air, and maritime formations capable of fighting together at scale. And this is a big challenge. And I think the second issue, in my mind, has to do with the so-called strategic enablers or critical enablers, right? So things like command and control, ISR, targeting, lift, air and missile defense, long-range strike, electronic warfare, and so on. Those capabilities are central to the NATO way of warfare, which is essentially the American way of warfare. And it relies on the US backbone. So I think at present, current NATO strategy and regional plans and so on and so forth revolve around the assumptions that US critical enablers will be available for Europe indefinitely. And I don't know if that's true, actually. Particularly if there's a war in the Indo-Pacific, well, we may not be able to count on all those enablers, right? And I think that links back to the theme of strategic simultaneity. And Europeans are trying to reduce some dependencies when it comes to critical enablers, but it's going to take a long time, particularly before they can integrate all of these capabilities at scales. So I think those are sort of the two main issues, force structure and critical enablers, the two main sort of challenges on the path towards primary responsibility for conventional defense. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Right. So if I can ask a follow-up question, is it a matter of timeline that Europe is stepping up while US is pulling back or stepping down or stepping whatever? Do you think it's in terms of what you say about the force structure and critical enabler aspect? Is this sort of like a timing issue that is very difficult? Because Justin, you said that like Europe could be relatively okay compared to in the Pacific. You're suggesting that it's not really okay. Like, is it in the long term, do you think that if you think about, because the next question I'd like to get to is the US, is it sort of something that could be solved, or like, are you arguing that if you think about the more critical enabler factor, that US needs to stay beyond what the current suggestion is that conventional forces will be basically in the hands of Europe, and the US basically offers the nuclear umbrella. You think that it's not the division of labor that can be sustained? Is that your point, or is it?
No. Look, let me say something on this. So I agree with what Justin said earlier, but I would also perhaps nuance that topic a little bit. So, and I also agree, by the way, with the fact that China-Russia cooperation is one of the main factors bringing together the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, which is not to say that they're a single theater. They are not. Deterrence is primarily a local and a regional business, but there are many factors that sort of connect the two theaters. I actually think the most important factor connecting the two theaters is not China-Russia security cooperation. I think the most important factor connecting both theaters is that our deterrence and alliance architectures revolve around the same factor, which is US military power. And the fact that US military resources are finite, that means that what the US does in one region will indirectly, but very importantly, affect what happens in the other region. Now, I agree with Justin. First, the scale of the threat to the balance of power that this region faces is far more daunting than what you see in Europe, because China is much more powerful than Russia, not only in a conventional military sense, but also if you look at power comprehensively. Also, the European defense system has a lot of depth, right? If you look at Cold War NATO, the dividing line was in Berlin. Now NATO sort of expanded all the way through Europe's two internal seas, Mediterranean and even the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. and is actually very close on land to St. Petersburg. We have the defensive perimeter from a US perspective, from a Baltic perspective, not so much, but has a lot of depth, whereas in East Asia there's no depth, right? Because China directly embraces the sea. So it's more daunting, the security situation in Asia than it is in Europe, and I actually believe it is in the European interest that the US prioritizes East Asia, because that is where the main challenge to US military power comes from. So they better get that right, we better facilitate that process. Having said that, I think we should not, I would go back to what I was saying earlier. Yes, if you compare Europe and Russia on paper and you assume that Europe is a unified political and military actor, then things are fine. But Europe is not a unified political and military actor. Europeans do cooperate. They do cooperate more than East Asian countries. They are more cohesive strategically and politically than East Asian countries, but they are not a cohesive political and military actor. And one of the examples that I laid out has to do with force structure. In fact, I would go even further and say that US forward presence and engagement in Europe has been the single most important factor behind European cohesion and political unity, and even European integration itself. So I think we could cope with a situation whereby the United States downsizes significantly in Europe, but I think we better make sure that there is still a level of US presence, both political and military, in Europe that can underpin European cohesion and deterrence in the Euro-Atlantic area.
Can I clarify? I mean, I do completely agree. The issue why I in part raise it is not because necessarily Europe has their total act together, as Dr. Simon says, but the capability is there if they want to. And often in a crisis, that's when you do put past your regulatory and governance obstructions, as I think we have seen in the post-full-on invasion. I think there have been many positives in European cooperation. The issue that part of the reason I raise it is, and I'm completely supportive again and agree that we don't want US withdrawal, but it's only NATO countries that are talking about it. It's France and Canada that are the ones who are talking about strategic autonomy or a middle power coalition. There's a reason why Australia and Japan are not. You won't hear as much as what the speech at Davos was by Prime Minister Hikotani got, global recognition as wonderful prose and wonderful theatre. You're not going to have the Japanese Prime Minister or the Australian Prime Minister or the Korean give such a speech because we simply don't have the capability, even if we got ourselves together. So I think, and it is far more daunting. To give a sense of why it's daunting, in the Cold War, none of the US allies relied on the Soviet economy. We are all dependent on the Chinese economy right now. Worse is it would have been unfathomable to think that we would have relied on Soviet technology through the Cold War. But we are all dependent on Chinese technology right now. If you, from an Australian perspective, if you drive an electric vehicle, no matter which make you're driving, the most important parts is the Chinese battery. How have we allowed ourselves to do that? If you put solar panels on your roof in Australia, 9 out of 10 are Chinese, 3 out of 10 have been made through the Xinjiang modern slavery forced labour supply chain. That would be unheard of in the Cold War. So it's not just the military side, it's the whole economic, the whole technological dominance. That's daunting, and we've got to work together to get ourselves out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Let me say that I agree with Justin that I think the region generally does not want to see the US leave. Some countries are more forward in saying that. Singapore is one of those, but many hide behind our backs, and let one voice go forward. But I believe that most of the countries in the region do not want to see the United States leave the region. I also think that I don't think the US will completely leave the region. It will be there, but they have always had this idea of being, an offshore balancer. They give you the weapons, they give you assistance, but they try not to fight your battles. And that's what the US will do. Now, you have pointed out to something about the nature of China and the Chinese threat. Let me emphasize again that in ASEAN countries, many countries don't see China as an enemy or a threat. They feel, yes, we have all our problems with China, but China is not an enemy. The South China Sea, we work with it. On a bad day, China is a bully. But you have disputes over borders, you work to try to sort that out. So it's not in the same way. Also, we don't think China is as reckless and adventurous as Russia. Russia is reckless, So it's different. Now, you are right in saying that now China trades with everybody, invests in many countries. We use Chinese technology. So it's a very different kind of entity that you have to deal with. It is not the Soviet Union, which is why I think there are countries, ASEAN countries say, you cooperate, you have differences, and you try to work out those differences. You build your deterrence also. It's not as if we do not build deterrence, So it's a combination of all tactics. It's not like, I treat you as an enemy and forever you're an enemy. No, you try to work out your differences. And so, because China is different from the Soviet Union.
So that, if I can turn it back to Professor Mori, that seems to go against what you mentioned about Japan's effort to make a hub of regional deterrence in Asia. And I'd like to ask for your response on that. But since we don't have an American on the panel, and that is obviously the elephant or whatever in the room, I'd like to ask you about the US commitment question. And that how much do you think, because it's really hard to separate spite and sentiment from strategy, from what comes out from the US, especially the president. How much of the US-Europe policy is a sentiment or strategy? You can read it as strategy. And how about the Indo-Pacific? How much of it is a strategy? How do you read the long-term commitment, not just the capacity, but the commitment intentions of the US in Europe and Indo-Pacific, and what are the differences, and what do you think are you most concerned about, if I can ask?
Thank you. Yeah, I think you threw in a lot of questions at the very end.
Yeah, like you're both a Japan expert and US expert.
Part first.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So what is the driver of US regional commitment towards the Indo-Pacific? At the risk of oversimplification, I'm going to say this. I think not only during the Trump administration, but beyond, US is likely to oscillate between interest-driven, which is like pursuing economic interest, and also interest plus values-driven. And it used to be interest plus value plus strategic dominance, but that is now gradually sort of dissipating a little bit. So you're going to have two different modes, like mostly interest-driven and interest plus value-driven, which is a sort of a more democratic administration approach. What is important is in both approaches, economic interest is very important. So I think the driver of US commitment towards the region depends on how much economic growth we are able to achieve in this part of the world. As long as US recognizes that Indo-Pacific economic vitality is connected to US economic growth, then there will be successive administrations that will be motivated to maintain influence in this region and maintain access to this region. We oftentimes talk about the United States turning its back towards free trade agreements, but that does not mean that trade is not non-existent. Trade is there, right? And investment is also there. So what is very important for us is to take initiatives that will keep our economy growing and connected to the United States, regardless of these tariff challenges and and other political and security challenges and so forth. But having said that, I think, I mentioned about President Trump going to Beijing in my previous intervention, but also want to sort of highlight this point that it's not only about US-China economic transaction, US strategy in the region. There's a lot of media attention on that aspect. And people worried about spheres of influence, G2, and so all those kind of discourse. But it's not only that. In the realm of defense, I think it's pretty much China, I'll use the term versus, but versus US, Japan, Australia, Philippines, the so-called Squad framework is there. And I think military to military defense authority cooperation is strong as ever. And it's kind of interesting to see some of the political uncertainties actually motivating the military to military cooperation. And they feel that they need to be the anchor of stability in the region. So if you look at the defense area, you see more of a sort of alliance-based deterrence approach that is forming and getting stronger, and lots of continuity rather than change. In the area of technology and critical minerals, I fully agree with Justin's point about us being connected with China, but I think we are trying to sort of mitigate the risks of weaponization of supply chains by China as much as possible. So right now, I think one of the important initiatives that is undertaken by not only Indo-Pacific, US, and allied partners, and also with European partners, is the area of critical mineral supply chain security, right? It's one of the rare agendas that they agree on G7 and so forth, right? So here, I think there's a lot of opportunities and efforts made to sort of reduce the risk of being exposed to Chinese economic coercion that utilizes these economic means for political purposes, right? And so there's a different, also a sort of a picture in the advanced technologies and critical minerals area. So in addition to economic transaction, there's defense, which is a different area, and also advanced technologies and critical minerals. So the picture is far sort of nuanced, I think. It's not only like President Trump and President Xi doing a deal and changing everything. There are different dimensions to the international relations of the Indo-Pacific, and there are different actors involved. So I don't think the United States is suddenly going to sort of compromise and retreat or retrench in the Western Pacific and so forth. I think its dynamic is much more sort of complicated and diverse and so forth. So that's how I see it. But nevertheless, it is true that when we all read the national security strategy and the national defense strategy of the United States, we all thought that there's going to be prioritization and deprioritization, right? We all thought that Indo-Pacific and Western Hemisphere is going to be prioritized, and Middle East and Europe is going to be deprioritized. But at the end of the day, we had epic fury, and we found out that the region is not prioritized, but compartmentalized in the mind of President Trump. I think he's makes important decisions on an issue-by-issue basis. He doesn't take into account a sweeping global strategic consideration. He doesn't take into account inter-regional consequences of taking action in one theater, affecting another one. So I think there, as I fully agree with Luis's point that because we are affected by these decisions, and we do not know what kind of decision will be made in the next 2.5 years, but in order to sort of offset those kind of risk, regional states have to step up. And particularly in the realm of defense production. I think that effort is going to be critical. And that's why we have so much talk about defense industry cooperation these days. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
So you're suggesting that maybe we're thinking about maps in the session right now, about regions, but maybe it's important to look not just about the maps, because that might not be the way that issues are compartmentalized in the minds of President Trump.
Yes.
Yeah. How would you view the situation? Japan and Australia is known to be very much like an alliance almost. Do you think that the motivations behind that from the Australians' point of view is similar to what Professor Mori mentioned about the outlook about the US commitment in the region?
No, I think two things can be right at the same time. I think Australia is positive about US commitment to this region. In a way that there's perhaps more natural concerns about US commitment to NATO. But I think it's a separate issue that Australia has in recent years viewed Japan as its most aligned country, in part because of the US, both allies of the US. We have a great trilateral with the US that should be used more. It should be re-enlivened, the trilateral. We are part of the Quad. I'm a big believer of the Quad, notwithstanding some pessimism about it. But I think the Quad is a force for good. And of course, Australia is part of AUKUS, which, in my view, part of the benefit of AUKUS for the region, notwithstanding a bit of a turbulent start to AUKUS in 2021, but part of the benefit is that it actually helps keep the US in the region. The only reason that AUKUS exists is China. So it's actually an Indo-Pacific partnership, in my view. And of course, we've got the Five Eyes. So I think Australia and Japan, well, the Five Eyes with the US, but the Australia and Japan, in my view, you said it's close to alliance. When the Prime Minister Takako visited Australia, she referred to a quasi-alliance. I'm of the view, maybe a bit ambitious at this stage, but I'm of the view that Australia and Japan is effectively an alliance right now without the formal treaty. I think we should work ourselves towards a treaty. I think bilaterally would be good. I think it would be, again, very good for the region. I do think, though, what is an issue with the US, if I can take that part of the question, if the US is transactional, purely transactional, it may work with countries that are not its peer. It can use the combined power, military, economic and technological power to say to other countries, well, we want you to do these things. As it said to NATO, we want you to spend more on defence, etc. I'm not convinced it works with China. And I think the one area of transactionalism that we need to monitor is we should be concerned by, for example, the transaction of soybeans for chips. I think a former Deputy National Security Advisor of Trump in his first term, Matt Pottinger, described that type of arrangement as the US returning to being an agrarian country. It shouldn't be the case that the US or countries like Australia and Japan are focused on the selling of whether it be US soybeans or Canada, I think it was some other seed, Australia lobster, in return for China's focus on technology, which is the future. China wins there. And I think to use the word of being lulled and being complacent, we've got to learn from history. History is vital for us here, and it doesn't have to go back to World War II or the Cold War. If you go back to 2000, end of President Clinton's term, he was asked about China's the site that people had on, or what people were seeing China using cyberspace maliciously, including to steal IP, etc. And Clinton publicly said that controlling the internet is like, the famous line, like nailing Jello to a wall, meaning it's impossible. And he actually wished China good luck. Well, within a number of years, China had shown that it could use the internet against us. And then in the Arab Spring, I was in the Australian intelligence community at the time. The Arab Spring, you recall, the analysis was that, well, social media, the greatest thing for democracy ever, the authoritarian regimes aren't going to be able to control social media. Well, look at Brexit, look at 2016 US election campaign. China and Russia showed they could control Western social media. 2011, Elon Musk was asked, do you think China is a competitor for electric vehicles? He laughed to the journalist and asked him the question, said they're never going to compete. Well, BYD now sells more electric vehicles. You then had 5G. Australia was the first country to prohibit Huawei and ZTE from 5G, but leading up to 5G, if you'd said to the Americans, you're not going to have one company that can do this telecommunications network role, I think they would have said, well, that can't be right. But there isn't one. TikTok. The Americans in 2018 said, well, maybe China can compromise our own technology and they can intrude, but they'll never have the innovative genius to compete with American technology on social media. Well, more Americans use TikTok now than any of the American platforms. we've got to stop being complacent. We've got to stop saying, well, we are just naturally better at China. And we've got to recognise that we've got to give respect to what China is doing, and particularly as we head towards AI, I do think we can't afford to make the mistake of the internet, the mistake of social media, the mistake of 5G. We have to say, well, how do we work together? And for that, we then have to work together. We have to, and it's not just Australia, Japan, it has to be Australia and Japan with ASEAN, with Europe together to ensure that there are alternatives, because in the world of adoption, we lost 5G. Most of the world, most of ASEAN is using Huawei.
Yes.
In AI, the frontier race, which is dominant, and the argument of, OpenAI and Anthropic, they may be 6-7 months ahead of Chinese frontier companies. Well, great. I hope the American companies win. I hope they always win. But if we only focus on the frontier race and we lose adoption, the globe is going to be using Chinese technology.
I think they've already lost the adoption because it's cheaper. And very many regions in the world do not have AI skills that require the cutting edge Anthropic, and so on.
We've got to help. We've got to then do more than just say we're going to win the frontier race. We've got to.
You have to distribute.
That's exactly right.
Diffuse.
Yeah.
So coming back to the topic of the cross-theater cooperation, I think, Ambassador Chan, you mentioned that you don't appreciate NATO coming into
not
the
enthusiastic.
region. Not enthusiastic.
But I want to emphasize a point in case it is lost. We welcome European countries coming because their ships come, and that's fine. And in fact, most of the countries buy some European, military equipment.
But you mentioned not with the NATO flag, because you mentioned three things. One, NATO sometimes doesn't quite get Asia.
Yes.
Number two, ASEAN is inclusive, and NATO is not. And three, ASEAN does not have a shared threat perception. And with that, I'm going to ask you, Dr. Simón, even with that rebuttal, what would you say about cross-theater cooperation?
Yeah, so I would say that NATO is not interested in coming to Asia. That's a non-debate. I mean, there was a debate about sending one person to some office here in Japan in a building in Tokyo. That I don't think that amounts to NATO coming to Asia. I think NATO is very much interested in focusing on Europe. Actually, the message coming from the United States is crystal clear. Guys, forget about Asia. Just focus on, upholding deterrence in Eastern Europe, and Europeans actually agree. So, and even if the Americans say, guys, you should come over, which is what the Biden administration was saying, you would have pushback from Europeans, the French, even the Poles saying, no, actually, we've got plenty of business here. So there's no debate about NATO coming to Asia. What there's a debate about is NATO partnering with like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, including, first and foremost, Japan and Australia also are okay, around certain things. Now, what things? So I think, look, I mean, I would trying to put a sort of constructive spin on the message coming from the Trump administration. The Trump administration is saying, you guys should focus on Europe, you guys should focus on the Indo-Pacific, because that is where you can make the best difference, and where you're most needed. Europeans and Indo-Pacific allies of the United States actually agree with that message. They don't disagree. There's no pushback there. So I think I would not speak of a single theater. I think all this talk of a single theater that we heard a couple of years ago, I think that was misplaced. There's no single theater, right? I mean, deterrence is by and large local, regional game. You need to pay attention to the strategic geography of each region, and you need to tailor your deterrence strategy, your force structure, your operational concepts around that. Now, having said that, I think that from an operational and strategic viewpoint, the challenge that we at NATO and Indo-Pacific allies of the United States, particularly Japan, Australia, face is, in my view, remarkably similar. Why? Because we are both looking at how to implement deterrence by denial, to use another Colbian phrase, against a superior adversary who is trying to roll out, who is nuclear armed, and who is trying to roll out its so-called anti-access scenario denial capabilities to complicate the access of our external security guarantor into our regions, and therefore establish local escalation dominance, right? Our security guarantor, who actually happens to be the same. So we have a very similar operational and strategic problem conceptually. That means that we're going to be looking at very similar sets of operational concepts, capabilities, technologies, munitions, and defense industrial solutions. So whereas we may not want to cooperate directly operationally in the sense that Europeans are not, well, you never say never because you never know what's going to happen in the war, but in principle, we're going to be focusing operationally in our respective regions. When it comes to generating the industrial solutions, the capability solutions, the technologies, the operational concepts that underpin deterrence by denial, we'll actually be looking for similar solutions. And I think by cooperating upstream, when it comes to defense industry, when it comes to technologies, when it comes to adaptation, I think we can create synergies and scale that allow us to benefit mutually. So I would distinguish between the sort of the downstream elements, the operational elements of deterrence, and I think in that context, I would agree that we need to sort of separate the dynamics of each theater and the sort of upstream elements of deterrence, particularly defense industry, technology. And here, actually, even the Trump administration agrees and is in favor of NATO IP4 cooperation when it comes to those elements. So I think that's the most promising area going forward.
Right.
Can I ask, I suppose I don't disagree that there are not different theatres. I suppose the issue is, though, that the same players are in those different theatres. So the issue I think we've got to grapple with is, while the European theatre with Russia's war in Ukraine is different to the what China is potentially doing in the South China Sea and Taiwan, China is a player in both theatres. So we have to treat, even if it's different elements, I do think we have to treat them as no longer being separated by their not only geography but players. I think the same player is dominant everywhere.
No, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying that China is a dominant player in the European theater. I do agree with your statement that China has been a very important enabler, a critical enabler even, of Russia's war effort. I mean, I think this discussion is not that dissimilar from the discussion in the Cold War, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was a global challenge, but the center of gravity of that challenge was in Europe, right? So how do you distinguish between the two? It's very difficult, right? You need to counter, but sometimes, and this is the argument that Bruce Colby and others are making, is like sometimes we're going to have to let things go in other theaters because otherwise we might be on the losing side of a cost competition with China, in the sense that sometimes it might be easier for China to create chaos or advance in a secondary theater than it would be for the United States to try to remedy that, right? So there are always opportunity costs. So it's very difficult. It's because it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, China is indeed a global challenge, but the central gravity of that challenge, certainly from a US perspective, is in the Indo-Pacific. Having said that, and I fully agree with what Justin was saying, Europe also matters from the perspective, not just militarily. I was focusing on the military dimension of the problem, but Europe also matters from in US-China competition from a broader perspective, right? And from that viewpoint, I think there's a strong incentive for the United States to, going back to the previous discussion, to remain engaged in Europe, because the US actually derives a huge benefits from its European presence. US defense industry, US high tech, they have a dominating position in the European market. The European market gives them a critical mass that otherwise they would not have. It also brings payoffs in terms of diplomatic alignment by Europe, and so on and so forth, right? So this is to say that I kind of agree with what Justin was saying, It's just how do you find the balance between the fact that competition with China is global with the reality that there's a center of gravity and everything matters. Technology, culture, trade, everything matters. But in my view, the center of gravity of that competition is the military balance in East Asia. So how do you reconcile those two realities? Well, that's something we're all trying to grapple with.
So I'm going to ask Professor Mori to wear the Japan hat now. And what about Japan? Like, it was reported that Prime Minister Takaichi did not go to the NATO summit meeting, and yet at the same time, there was report about how 6 self-defense force officers are going to be sent to the Ukrainian support mission in Germany. And that's actually not new. The self-defense force have had people sent to the headquarters for quite a while now. So what do you make of Japan's interest effort? And you mentioned the office issue, but other than that, why would Japan be interested in NATO? Because after all, the foreign minister, defense minister did go, and it does seem to be meaningful. So what's your take on Japan and NATO and that level of cross-theater interest? Yes.
Japan is sort of pursuing a functional coalition building or cooperation seeking. And NATO is just one, I shouldn't say just, but one of the major sort of framework through which Japan's trying to seek cooperation in various areas. And to sort of put Japan's sort of strategic task into perspective, I think there are 2 major strategic supply chain issues for Japan. Number 1 is critical minerals dependency on China. Number 2 is advanced weapons dependency on the United States. And you have backlogs issues that are quite serious, right? On both issues, there is a case to be made that US allies should help each other to sort of boost capacity, not only in critical minerals, but also on, which is actually has huge implications militarily, and also for weapons production, licensed production of various kinds. I think we're trying to advance. I think the United States faces a severe sort of supply capacity restrictions, particularly as a result of not only Epic Fury, but it was there even before Iran, right? And so I think there is a strong case to be made. Luis mentioned about defense industry cooperation. I think that's where we are heading right now with full steam. And but the important thing is that in order to be able to talk meaningfully about cross-theater defense production cooperation, you have to achieve your target level before you start talking about helping others. And I think there we are below where we want to be. Mm-hmm. And so at the very beginning, I think one of the important things is to get as much as production capacity and capability and technology from the United States, transfer it over to the frontline states, mm-hmm. and allow those companies to boost and ramp up defense production. So that is what I would call the resilience in the defense realm. Mm-hmm. I think Japan's overall approach, we've been talking about resilience in many areas. We not only talk about sustained operational capability or KSN noreku, but we also talk about defense industry cooperation, resilience, resilience in critical minerals, resilience in cyber and critical infrastructure. And also, we ultimately have to talk about resilience of public resolve in confronting certain regional mm-hmm. potential flashpoints and conflicts. And so that's the broad picture. So when we think about cooperation with NATO, I think we have to clear about US roles, missions, and capabilities. I think there may be variations, and I know that you are fully aware of that. But at the end of the day, you mentioned the term upstream. I think that's where we are. That's where potentially where we do have common challenges and where there is opportunity mm-hmm. for certain NATO countries and Japan to pursue. And in some cases, we are already cooperating in the realm of cyber and space with NATO countries, with individual agreements and so forth. So that's how Japan, I think, sees the overall framework in NATO, where we situate NATO when we talk about cooperation with NATO. Yeah.
Thank you. So before we open for questions, I'd like to ask the final question to Ambassador Chan. Is that given the developments that we were talking about between Japan and Europe and Australia, Japan has been, in various polls done by your institute too, Japan is the most trusted partner from ASEAN's countries' point of view. But are the recent developments seen to be more stabilizing or destabilizing for the ASEAN region? And also, from a Singaporean point of view, how do you see Japan's developments? Because things have been changing. There's been lots of things happening in Japan with regards to its policy. How is that viewed to be? Is that more reassuring for the region, or is it more worrisome?
You know, I am chair of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute. Every year we conduct a State of Southeast Asia survey, and we ask many questions. If forced to choose, who will you choose? You know, and it's interesting, over 8 years, the region chooses the US, but on 2 occasions, they chose China. This year, they chose China. Unfortunately, both times it had to do with President Trump, you know. But Japan comes out as the most trusted partner of all the powers in the region, consistently over the 8 years. So Japan is a very trusted power. In this uncertain time, I think, and I will talk about that when I discuss ASEAN tomorrow and Japan cooperation, I think ASEAN is very appreciative of what Prime Minister Takayashi has offered in terms of the $10 billion Asian fund for the energy. It's the energy fund. Most of it will go to Southeast Asia. It's buying a year of petroleum, you know, fuel. So it's gestures like this. I think Japan has been offering maritime cooperation, and that has been welcomed, you know. In fact, in the Straits of Hormuz, we have a control mechanism which is looked after by Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And we look after marine safety, maritime safety, and pollution. And we invite stakeholders to contribute to keeping up standards for us, you know, give us some equipment, help in the fund. And Japan contributes to this. Germany contributes also. UAE, China also contributes, you know, but Japan is a contributor. And I don't think that in all this recent talk, I don't think the view of Japan has changed. Yeah, it's a positive view.
So there isn't that much of a concern of Japan remilitarizing, in partnering with NATO not to be seen as
It's not come out in public discussions.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions. I ask you to wait for the microphone and introduce yourself and ask who you're asking the question to. Yes, please.
My name is Shikata, company fellow, Mitsui Company. Let me ask Ambassador Chan.
Yes.
I lived in Singapore in 1990s. I always admire Singapore. But at the same time, I have a little bit concern about Singapore's attitude toward China. For example, CPTPP, reportedly, your Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, welcomed China's entry into CPTPP when they met Xi Jinping. And also you said that the China is different from Russia. But I think it seems to be they are similar in that both countries are very hegemonic, like China is going to unify Taiwan, annex Senkaku Islands. They totally ignore 2016 UNCLOS tribunal. Under such circumstances, we should be very cautious of China, but at the same time, we need to get along with China. So this kind of bamboo diplomacy, like Vietnam do, is maybe a good idea for Asian countries, including Japan and Singapore, all ASEAN countries. I'd like to ask your opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. I hope you had a good time in Singapore, staying there. Yes, my Prime Minister, and I think my new Prime Minister, Prime Minister Wong, we've said that we would support China if it chooses to apply to CPTPP. That is because any member applicant who wants to join this grouping must agree to abide by the standards and sign on to the standards. So our sense is if China wants to use CPTPP to change some of its internal standards and abide by the standards, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. That's CPTPP. So it's issue by issue. You are right in saying that, Singapore seems to be working with China on some things, but a bit wary on others. In fact, we are watching cybersecurity, for instance. Right now, there's a campaign targeted against Singapore, and the source seems to come from China. It says that Singapore is overrun by Indians. There are many websites that pass this message. Why is it overrun by Indians? Singapore is a multi-ethnic nation, multiracial, Chinese, Malays, Indians. We welcome all. To say that attacks at our ethnic cohesion policy. And so we are watching that. We actually named the website, Influencers. Influencers are used to say this. Singapore is this, Singapore is that. And we consider that if any country attacks our ethnic cohesion, our model of the national identity, that's crossing a line. Mm-hmm. So we view this and watch this very carefully. So, it's living in Southeast Asia, living in Asia, and being a small state with other small states and middle-sized states. So we have to work with China. We've got to deter some aspects, but we watch. So I think this is balancing. And that's why we say, don't force us to choose. We will want to balance our relationships.
Yeah.
Could I ask also the TPP question? For me, I think fortunately the TPP requires all 12 countries to agree.
Yes, you need that.
And so Australia, Japan and the UK, I can't envisage the foreseeable future at all, those three countries agreeing. And I think we should learn from the mistake made on the World Trade Organization that China was allowed in before it hit so what Ambassador Chan said is right, that the beauty about the TPP is you've got to meet standards. You can't just say you'll meet standards. So the mistake made of WTO, you've got to show it. So
yes.
The reality is right now, China isn't meeting the standards because it's using economic coercion in full breach of WTO TPP. It has been using economic coercion for years against Australia, against Japan. So I think hopefully the TPP strength will be there. The other thing to remember is that if you allow China into the TPP, because it does then have all countries agreement to it, you would then find that the US and Taiwan, not the US wants in at the moment, but if in the decades to come it ever wanted to, you would never have the US or Taiwan in TPP because China would veto it. But yeah, it would need all 12 countries.
Should bring the US in at the same time. Persuade them to come in. The door is always open.
The door is open
for
the US.
The US, yes. Because I think most of us see the US as a very important economic player as well in the region.
Yes. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
My name is Mr. Kato of Waseda University. I have a question to Mr. Justin Bassi. My question is about ASPI's effort to create Indo-Pacific hybrid COE. And I think this effort is remarkable in the sense that, this is exactly the kind of cross-theater, cross-regional effort to deal with the common agenda or issues that both Europe and Indo-Pacific nations face right now. And I think it is remarkable in the sense that it tried to deal with the hybrid threat presented by China with the framework of Europe and Indo-Pacific without the United States. So I've been watching this effort very closely. And this pilot action is, as I understand, financed by EU and executed by your organization. But it seems to me that it takes more time than anticipated because of a number of the obstacles which Ambassador Chee actually described. One is a lack of shared threat perceptions among the Indo-Pacific states, and also the lack of institutionalized security architecture in this region. So I would like you to enlighten us with an update of this project as a specific example of the discussion that this panel has been talking about. What's the status of this initiative to create Indo-Pacific Center of Excellence to counter hybrid threat from China? You know you don't say it is China, but actually it's from China. Modeled after European Center of Excellence for hybrid threat. And what's the reason of the delay? It's been already there more than 2 years, right? And but I don't see it happen yet. And what are the obstacles? And how does this prospect look like? Is it going to really happen, or is it a non-starter? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question, and maybe I'll take a fair bit of that offline with you, but a very short answer is, because I could talk for hours on it, I'll spare you, and we've got only a few minutes. But I think it is a very good example of why we need cross-theatre cooperation, and you're right, that the European Union is working with my organisation to examine, you're right, a bit of a pilot initiative to examine whether the success that has been in Europe, and it's not only, but seen as an example through the Helsinki Centre of Excellence, and there are others, but the Helsinki one is well known and is doing a great job. Would that type of centre work in the Indo-Pacific? It has taken some time. It is ongoing. I wouldn't refer to it as a delay. I think part of the reason, part of the comments that Ambassador Chan has made, the different views in this region means that it is a little bit more complicated than simply saying we're going to grab the European Union and put one representative each in a centre. And I think for the reason you said, that initially when we were looking at this in Australia, the concern in the region was, well, if we have a centre of excellence in the Indo-Pacific, then it is just going to be China, China, China. And our ASEAN friends, even our Pacific friends, didn't really want it just to be an anti-China issue, which it shouldn't be. The really interesting part, and where cross-theatre helped, the European Union came in and said, well, we can see a gap here. We can see that hybrid threats, the reality is that hybrid threats are global, and the same challenges that we face in Europe from Russia, China is also there, but other countries are doing. So there is a gap. I think there is a distinct advantage that the Europeans have with the Centre of Excellence, because you get to share information. It doesn't just have to be about a military counter, but you share, you identify threats, you work together on what isn't working to prevent and to deter what is working. So I do think that the answer is that we have a significant gap, because the reality is that we have the same hybrid threats in this region that we see in Europe. And we would all benefit by working together. Whether it's the same model, don't know. But I think that Australia and Japan and ASEAN should work together. We just need to make sure that, perhaps unlike the Helsinki Centre, which is about Russia, let's face it, we have the ability to work together. I think we need something like that in our region. But it, again, shouldn't just be about the Indo-Pacific. I think we should then work with our European friends and learn from what they have done over the years.
So thank you. On a very positive cross-theatre cooperation note, I'd like to thank the panelists for a great panel, and please join me in thanking them.
Thank you, Professor Hikotani and all our panelists. We will now take another short break. Our next session will begin at 5. Please be back in your seats on time. Thank you.